Welcome to another deep dive investigation of Inside American Politics by Skoob. I'm your host, Bradley Teller, and today we're peeling back the layers of one of the most shocking political events in recent American history, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania on July 13, 2024. What started as a routine campaign event turned into a nightmare that exposed security failures, claimed innocent lives, and sparked conspiracy theories that continue to divide America. Over the next hour, we'll walk through every critical detail, from the shooter's calculated approach to the tragic victims, from the security breakdowns that made it all possible, to the web of theories that emerged in the aftermath. This isn't just about politics. This is about how a single gunman came within a quarter inch of changing American history forever. Picture this. It's a warm July evening in Butler, Pennsylvania, a small town about 30 miles north of Pittsburgh. The Butler Farm Showgrounds at 625 Evans City Road, just 5 miles from downtown, are buzzing with excitement. Thousands of Trump supporters have gathered for what they expect to be just another campaign rally. But about 137 meters away, roughly 450 feet, a 20-year-old named Thomas Crooks is putting the final pieces of a deadly plan into motion. Here's what makes this so chilling. Crooks didn't just stumble into this opportunity. He was methodical, calculated, and disturbingly prepared. He parked his van on Lawrence Avenue, strategically avoiding the areas where police and Secret Service officers were conducting their security sweeps. That van, investigators later suspected, contained a considerable amount of explosives, a detail that should send shivers down anyone's spine. From his parking spot, Crooks walked to what would become his sniper's nest, a building positioned with a perfect line of sight to Trump's stage. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. There was a heavy-duty ladder conveniently positioned on the side of the building. Whether this was permanent fixture or something Crooks had planned for, we may never know for certain. The geography of this assassination attempt is crucial to understanding how it unfolded. We have 3 key structures: Trump's stage with the audience section directly behind it, a separate building where Secret Service personnel and snipers were positioned, and finally, the building where Crooks set up his deadly perch. The distances here are absolutely critical. Crooks was 137 meters from Trump, close enough that you wouldn't need to be an expert marksman to hit your target. But here's what's even more disturbing. He was only 134 meters, about 440 feet, from the Secret Service sniper position. Think about that. The people whose job it was to prevent exactly this kind of attack were close enough to potentially have a conversation with the shooter. As Trump began addressing his supporters at 6:12 p.m. Eastern Time, everything seemed normal. The former president spoke for about 6 minutes, working the crowd, hitting his usual talking points. Nobody in that audience could have imagined that death was literally overhead, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At 6:11 p.m., Thomas Crooks made his move. With his AR-15 semi-automatic rifle aimed at the former president, he squeezed the trigger. But what happened next was a combination of precision, chaos, and what can only be described as divine intervention or pure luck. The crowd saw him first. Someone yelled, "He's got a gun!" Another voice shouted, "On the roof, he's got a gun!" These weren't security personnel or trained spotters. These were ordinary Americans who noticed something the professionals had missed. Then came the gunfire. 3 shots rang out first. One of those bullets found its target, grazing Trump's ear. But here's the detail that should make your blood run cold. Another bullet missed the former president's head by just 1/4 of an inch. 1/4 of an inch. The width of a pencil eraser is all that stood between a wounded ear and a dead presidential candidate. What saved Trump's life? He had turned his head to look at a chart displaying statistics positioned to his left. If you watch the replay from the top angle, you can see exactly how that bullet would have traveled right through where his head had been just milliseconds before. Had Trump been facing the audience directly, we'd be telling a very different story today. After the initial 3 shots, there was a brief pause. Perhaps Crooks was assessing his accuracy. Perhaps his weapon jammed momentarily. Then came 5 more shots in rapid succession. 8 total shots fired at a former president of the United States while thousands watched in horror. At 6:11:34, just 22 seconds after the shooting began, Trump touched the right side of his face, realizing he'd been hit. 1 second later, at 6:11:35, he took cover as Secret Service agents swarmed the podium. "Get down, get down, get down!" they shouted, finally doing what they should have been doing before the first shot was ever fired. The Secret Service snipers, positioned on their own elevated location, finally engaged. Their bolt-action rifles, weapons capable of inflicting damage at ranges of 1,200 to 1,300 yards, made quick work of a target just 500 feet away. Thomas Crooks was dead, but the damage was already done. While the world focused on Trump's bloody ear and his defiant fist pump, the real tragedy was unfolding in the crowd below. This wasn't just an attack on a political figure, it was an attack on ordinary Americans who had come out to support their candidate. And 3 families were about to have their worlds destroyed forever. Corey Comperatore was 50 years old, a volunteer firefighter and former fire chief from Sarver, Pennsylvania. He was at the rally with his family, his wife and children, enjoying what should have been a peaceful evening of political engagement. When the bullets started flying, Comperatore didn't run. He didn't duck for cover and hope for the best. He threw himself between the gunfire and his family, using his own body as a shield. That decision cost him his life, but it saved theirs. When officials later reconstructed the scene, they found that Comperatore had been struck while protecting his wife and children from the gunfire. Communities across Pennsylvania held vigils in his honor. Flags were lowered, a hero had died, and most Americans wouldn't even know his name. But Comperatore wasn't the only victim. David Dutch, 57, from New Kensington, Pennsylvania, was also struck by the gunfire. The bullet tore through his chest and liver, leaving him fighting for his life. Doctors had to put him in a medically induced coma as they worked to save him. His family kept vigil at his bedside, not knowing if he would ever wake up, not knowing if they'd ever hear his voice again. James Copenhaver, 74, from Moon Township, Pennsylvania, was the 3rd victim. At 74 years old, this grandfather was simply exercising his right to participate in the democratic process. Instead, he ended up critically wounded, his family asking the public for support as he fought for his life in a hospital bed. Think about this for a moment. A 50-year-old firefighter, a 57-year-old father, a 74-year-old grandfather. These weren't political operatives or public figures. They were just Americans who believed in something strongly enough to spend their Saturday evening at a political rally. And they paid the ultimate price for that belief. Dutch eventually improved and was taken out of the coma, beginning a long and difficult recovery. Copenhaver also gradually stabilized, though both men faced months of medical treatment and therapy. Their stories became central to how this event was remembered, not as a political attack, but as an assault on ordinary citizens whose only crime was showing up to support their candidate. The shooting left lasting scars on the victims' families and the wider community. It renewed discussions about safety and violence in public life, and it raised uncomfortable questions about the risks ordinary people face when they choose to participate in democracy. These 3 men, Comperatore, Dutch, and Copenhaver, represent the true human cost of political violence in America. Now we get to the million-dollar question that has haunted investigators, lawmakers, and security experts ever since July 13th. How in the hell did this happen? We're talking about a former president of the United States, someone who receives top-level Secret Service protection. We're talking about an event that would have been planned weeks in advance, with advanced teams surveying every possible threat. And yet, a 20-year-old with a rifle was able to set up a sniper's nest with a direct line of sight to his target. Let's start with the basics. The Secret Service advance team would have been on the ground a week to 10 days before the rally, conducting threat assessments and establishing security perimeters. Anyone with even basic security training would have immediately identified that American Glass research building as a vulnerability. High ground, direct line of sight, not that far away, it's textbook sniper territory. So why wasn't it secured? The Secret Service director later claimed they had people inside the building. But here's the problem. You don't secure a low building like that from the inside. The value of that building to any adversary is the roof, the high ground. You have to have people up there. The director even tried to justify the decision by saying the roof was sloped, creating a safety factor for personnel. But anyone who's worked with snipers knows they're trained to position themselves in uncomfortable situations and stay there for extended periods. And here's the kicker. The Secret Service's own snipers were positioned on sloped roofs that very day. This brings us to a fundamental question about perimeters. Why was this building outside the inner security perimeter? Why weren't people approaching it required to go through magnetometers and security checks? The perimeter they established was incredibly tight. Too tight, as it turned out. But even if the building was outside the main perimeter, the Secret Service could have easily coordinated with local police to position officers on that roof. When you have a former president at an event, the Secret Service doesn't play well with others. They set the rules, and everyone else follows. If they had told local police to put people on that roof, it would have happened. Instead, we had a catastrophic breakdown in coordination and planning. Different agencies with unclear roles, overlapping responsibilities, and communication gaps that proved deadly. This wasn't treated as a conspiracy, but as a structural failure that exposed serious flaws in how we protect our political leaders. The most disturbing aspect might be Crooks's apparent foreknowledge of the security setup. He seemed to know exactly where to position himself, and he brought a ladder, suggesting he knew the roof wouldn't be occupied. This raises uncomfortable questions about whether he conducted surveillance during the advance team's setup, whether he was there in the days before to observe the security perimeter being established. Reports suggested people saw him acting strangely outside the magnetometer area. Did he initially plan to get inside the security perimeter? When he realized he couldn't penetrate the inner defenses, did he fall back on a predetermined plan to use the unsecured building? The fact that he was prepared with a ladder suggests this wasn't entirely improvised. Perhaps the most maddening aspect of the entire Butler rally shooting is how many warnings were ignored in the critical minutes before Thomas Crooks opened fire. This wasn't a case of a shooter appearing out of nowhere. Multiple people saw him, identified him as a threat, and tried to alert authorities. The system failed them, and it failed Donald Trump. Let's reconstruct those crucial moments. People in the crowd spotted Crooks on the roof before he started shooting. They weren't security professionals or trained spotters. They were ordinary rally attendees who noticed something obviously wrong. "He's got a gun!" someone shouted. "On the roof, he's got a gun!" another voice called out. These weren't quiet observations or subtle signals. These were people literally screaming warnings about an armed man positioned to kill the former president. And yet, somehow, this urgent information failed to trigger immediate action from the security teams. This points to a massive breakdown in communication protocols. At a properly secured event, there should be clear channels for reporting threats, rapid ways to verify and escalate warnings, and immediate response procedures when credible threats are identified. None of that seemed to function at Butler. The delay between the crowd's warnings and any meaningful response may have been caused by unclear reporting chains and the difficulty of passing urgent information through multiple layers of security bureaucracy. In a crowded, noisy environment, those precious seconds turned into a deadly window of opportunity for the shooter. Think about the chain of communication that should have happened. Crowd member spots threat, reports to nearest officer, officer radios to command center alerts, Secret Service detail, Secret Service moves to neutralize threat and protect Trump. Instead, we had people literally pointing at a man with a rifle while he calmly lined up his shots. This communication failure becomes even more inexplicable when you consider the technology available to modern security operations. Multiple radio networks, direct communication lines, visual surveillance systems, and yet somehow the message, "There's a man with a gun on the roof," couldn't travel 400 feet fast enough to save lives. The breakdown in coordination wasn't limited to the moments before the shooting. Even the division of responsibilities between local police and Secret Service created dangerous gaps. Local officers thought certain areas were outside their jurisdiction, while Secret Service assumed local forces were covering the outer perimeter. In the end, some of the most dangerous positions weren't being watched by anyone. This institutional failure shows how modern security breakdowns can occur even without malicious intent. When agencies don't have clear command structures, when communication systems are slow or confusing, when responsibilities overlap without coordination, small gaps can quickly become life-threatening vulnerabilities. In the aftermath of the Butler shooting, as investigators worked to piece together what happened, another narrative began emerging in certain circles. One that painted the assassination attempt not as a security failure but as an inside job orchestrated by shadowy forces within the government itself. The conspiracy theories gained traction partly because of how little information was initially released about the case. Thomas Crooks's apartment was quickly cleaned and sanitized. The roof where he positioned himself was power washed. Physical evidence seemed to disappear almost as quickly as it was collected. For people already suspicious of government institutions, this created the perfect storm of speculation. The theory goes something like this. Elements within what's often called the deep state, primarily the NSA, FBI, and CIA, were involved in trying to eliminate Trump. These agencies, according to this narrative, had enough time between the shooting and any potential investigation to scrub evidence and cover their tracks. Proponents point out that the same intelligence officials who promoted the Russia collusion narrative, figures like John Brennan and others, could have activated assets, identified Trump's location at Butler, coordinated the timing of an attack, and then sanitized the scene while Secret Service Director Kim Cheadle played the role of incompetent administrator, taking the blame for security failures. The precedent they cite is revealing. The Russia investigation, which they argue didn't require many people to create and sustain, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, Andy McCabe, James Comey, and supporters within the DNC and Hillary Clinton's campaign. If this relatively small group could obtain FISA warrants and sell a narrative to the American people, the theory goes, what else might be possible? What makes these theories particularly compelling to believers is the stark contrast between the government's usual information management and the silence surrounding crooks. Usually, investigators leak details, politicians grandstand, and media outlets dig up extensive background information. But with crooks, the information flow seemed unusually controlled and limited. However, critics of these theories point out some fundamental problems with the deep state narrative. FBI Deputy Director Paula Bates stated that investigators conducted thousands of interviews, addressed over 2,000 public tips, analyzed data from seized devices, reviewed nearly 500,000 digital files, and collected hundreds of hours of video footage. This suggests a thorough investigation rather than a cover-up. Moreover, there's a logical inconsistency in many conspiracy theories about the event. As one analyst put it, two things can't be true at once. Either it's an inside job with deep state involvement, where this guy was manufactured and placed on the roof with official assistance, or officials somehow let this geeky, nerdy 20-year-old bypass all elements of security, get on the roof, and do nothing when people were screaming that he was there. The more prosaic explanation, massive institutional incompetence and coordination failures, might actually be more disturbing than conspiracy theories. It suggests that our security apparatus isn't competent enough to protect our leaders, even when they're trying their best. The FBI described a general absence of information about crooks on social media, which struck some observers as suspicious. How does a 20-year-old in 2024 have virtually no digital footprint? But this observation came just 17 days after the shooting, before the complete investigation was finished. What these theories ultimately reflect is a broader crisis of institutional trust in America. When people don't believe their government agencies are competent or honest, every unexplained detail becomes potential evidence of a cover-up. Every cleaned crime scene becomes proof of conspiracy rather than standard procedure. The conspiracy theories surrounding the Butler shooting point to a much larger problem in American society, the complete breakdown of trust between citizens and their institutions. Whether you believe the deep state theories or not, the fact that millions of Americans find them plausible reveals something deeply troubling about our current moment. Consider this. The same FBI that investigated Russian collusion, that conducted surveillance on American citizens, that has been at the center of numerous controversial cases over the years, is now asking the public to trust their investigation into an assassination attempt on a former president. For many Americans, that's simply not credible. The institutional trust problem isn't limited to one political party or ideology. Americans across the spectrum have lost faith in their government agencies' competence, honesty, and motives. When institutions consistently fail to provide transparent, credible explanations for major events, people naturally begin to construct their own explanations. This creates a vicious cycle. Agencies become more secretive to protect ongoing investigations, which increases public suspicion, which leads to more conspiracy theories, which causes agencies to become even more defensive and opaque. Meanwhile, the actual truth gets lost in the noise. The Russia investigation serves as a perfect example of how a relatively small number of influential people within government agencies can orchestrate significant operations with minimal oversight. If they could obtain FISA warrants based on questionable evidence and promote narratives that dominated news cycles for years, what other operations might be possible? But here's the counter-argument. Even if there are good individual agents within these agencies, the concern isn't about every employee. It's about the small number of highly placed individuals who wield enormous influence and power. These are people who can direct investigations, control information flow, and shape public perception of major events. The Butler shooting investigation became a test case for institutional credibility. Could the FBI conduct a transparent investigation? Could they provide satisfying answers to legitimate questions? Could they restore some measure of public trust in their competence and honesty? From one perspective, they tried. They conducted thousands of interviews, followed up on tips, analyzed digital evidence, and collected video footage. They briefed Congress and provided updates to the media. But from another perspective, the key questions remained unanswered, physical evidence was quickly cleaned up, and the shooter's motivations remained mysterious. This ambiguity allows multiple narratives to coexist. People who trust institutions see a thorough investigation hampered by a lack of evidence about an unstable young man's motivations. People who distrust institutions see a cover-up designed to hide evidence of a coordinated attack. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, not a grand conspiracy, but not complete institutional competence either. What we likely have is a combination of security failures, bureaucratic incompetence, and standard evidence handling procedures that, in the context of widespread institutional distrust, appear suspicious to many Americans. As we close this investigation into the Butler rally shooting, one detail refuses to fade: a quarter inch. That's how close America came to a moment that could have rewritten history forever. A shooter in position, security blind spots in plain sight, warnings ignored, lives lost, and a former president spared by a split-second turn of the head. But the real story doesn't end with survival. It's about the failures that allowed this to happen, the unanswered questions that followed, and the growing mistrust that fuels endless speculation. Was this deep incompetence, something darker, or a system stretched past its breaking point? Behind the headlines are lives permanently altered, families shattered, and a democracy that narrowly escaped catastrophe. And the most unsettling question remains: how close are we to the next almost? To hear the full investigation, deeper context, and details we couldn't fit here, download the Skoob app now and unlock the complete story. Stay informed, because some truths are too important to miss.